The complex precipitance of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. A multidimensional analysis. The Russian invasion of Ukraine, launched in February 2022, represents one of the most consequential geopolitical events of the 21st century. This conflict emerged from a confluence of historical grievances, ideological confrontations, intelligence failures, and strategic miscalculations. Drawing on insights from diplomatic accounts, military analyses, and geopolitical commentary, including perspectives from the No Agenda podcast, this report synthesizes the multifactorial causes and evolving dynamics of the war. Key findings reveal that Russia's actions were driven by Vladimir Putin's revisionist ambitions to dismantle Ukraine's sovereignty, NATO's eastward expansion perceived as an existential threat, and systemic intelligence misjudgments by Western agencies. Meanwhile, Ukraine's resilience has been bolstered by asymmetric warfare tactics, incremental Western military support, and a global narrative framing the conflict as a defense of democratic values. Historical context: the unresolved legacy of post-Soviet relations, the fractured post-Cold War order. The dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991 left Russia grappling with a loss of global influence and territorial cohesion. Ukraine's independence and subsequent pro-Western orientation, particularly after the 2014 Euromaidan Revolution, signaled a direct challenge to Putin's vision of a Russian sphere of influence. Former U.S. Ambassador John Sullivan underscores that Putin viewed NATO's expansion into Eastern Europe as a betrayal of tacit post-Cold War assurances, despite the absence of formal agreements. This perception of encirclement fueled Russia's narrative of defending compatriots in Ukraine's Donbas region, even as evidence of alleged genocide against ethnic Russians remained unsubstantiated. CIA's role and intelligence failures. The No Agenda podcast highlights the CIA's decades-long support for Ukrainian ultranationalist groups, which Moscow interpreted as covert regime change operations. These operations, coupled with U.S. intelligence agencies' overestimation of Ukrainian military capabilities, created a dangerous feedback loop. By 2022, the CIA reportedly believed its rebuilt agent networks in Russia could counteract Kremlin aggression, a claim skeptics likened to hallucinogenic wishful thinking. This overconfidence blinded Western policymakers to Putin's readiness for large-scale conflict. Geopolitical triggers: NATO, energy politics, and ideological warfare. NATO expansion as a catalyst. Putin's June 2021 summit with President Biden notably excluded substantive discussion of NATO's posture, revealing Russia's disinterest in diplomatic solutions. Instead, the Kremlin weaponized NATO's open-door policy to justify invasion, framing it as an existential threat despite the alliance's defensive mandate. Ambassador Sullivan argues that Russia's security concerns were less about immediate NATO encroachment and more about maintaining dominance over Ukraine's political trajectory. Energy leverage and the Nord Stream factor. The No Agenda podcast emphasizes Russia's strategic use of energy exports through Ukraine as both an economic weapon and a geopolitical bargaining chip. The Nord Stream pipelines, designed to bypass Ukrainian transit routes, exemplified Moscow's efforts to weaken Kyiv's economy while deepening European energy dependence. The 2022 invasion aimed to permanently sever Ukraine's role as an energy transit state, thereby consolidating Russia's leverage over Europe. Intelligence dynamics and covert operations. CIA's covert support and its repercussions. Declassified assessments reveal that CIA operatives provided tactical training and intelligence sharing to Ukrainian forces long before 2022, particularly after Russia's annexation of Crimea. While this support bolstered Ukraine's defensive capabilities, it also entrenched anti-Russian nationalist factions, whom Putin accused of persecuting Russian speakers. The No Agenda podcast critiques these efforts as short-sighted, arguing that they provoked Russia without adequately preparing Ukraine for full-scale war. Wagner Group and hybrid warfare. The rise of the Wagner Group, a Russian paramilitary organization, exemplifies Moscow's hybrid warfare strategy. Wagner's involvement in eastern Ukraine since 2014 provided plausible deniability for Russia's aggression, while its 2023 rebellion against the Kremlin exposed fissures within Putin's regime. The group's aborted march on Moscow, as documented in podcast transcripts, underscored the fragility of Russia's military command structure and the risks of outsourcing critical operations to mercenaries. Military strategies and the evolution of the conflict. Ukraine's asymmetric warfare innovations. Facing overwhelming conventional forces, Ukraine pioneered cost-effective asymmetric tactics. Maritime drone attacks on Russia's Black Sea Fleet, such as the 2023 strike on the Mekta pilot boat, disrupted logistical networks and symbolic power projections. The No Agenda podcast details how Ukraine's use of kamikaze drones and repurposed civilian technology allowed it to strike high-value targets like the Kerch Strait Bridge, despite limited long-range missile capabilities. Russia's adaptation and the stalemate in the east. Russia's initial blitzkrieg strategy faltered due to poor logistics and underestimated Ukrainian resistance. By 2024, the conflict devolved into a grinding war of attrition, with Russia leveraging artillery superiority and fortified defenses in Donbass. The May 2024 U.S. decision to permit limited strikes inside Russia using HIMARS systems marked a tactical shift, enabling Ukraine to degrade supply lines near Kharkiv. However, restrictions on ATACMS missiles preserved Russia's operational sanctuary, prolonging the stalemate. International reactions and the global order. Western aid and strategic ambiguities. The 2024 security agreements with Sweden, Norway, and Iceland, pledging $15 billion in combined aid, reflect Europe's belated recognition of the conflict's systemic implications. Sweden's transfer of ASC-890 AEW and Sea aircraft and F-16 fighters signifies a leap in Ukraine's air defense capabilities, though delivery timelines remain uncertain. Conversely, the Biden administration's incremental escalation, permitting cross-border strikes while withholding long-range missiles, illustrates the tension between deterrence and avoiding direct NATO-Russia conflict. The Global South's divergent perspectives. While Western nations framed the war as a defense of sovereignty, many Global South states remain skeptical of NATO's role. The No Agenda podcast critiques the U.S. for leveraging the conflict to weaken Russia economically through sanctions, which exacerbated global inflation and energy shortages. This schism complicates efforts to isolate Russia diplomatically, as seen in continued arms purchases from India and Turkey, societal impacts in the Russian diaspora, anti-war resistance, and exile communities. The Next Year in Moscow podcast documents the exodus of over 500,000 anti-war Russians following the invasion, many of whom now advocate for democratic reforms from exile. Figures like Grigory Sverdlin, who quotes Tolstoy's pacifist writings, symbolize the intellectual resistance to Putin's militarism. However, repression within Russia has silenced dissent, with state media propagating a distorted narrative of denazifying Ukraine. Ukraine's national identity reforged. Ukraine's societal cohesion, as analyzed in Explaining Ukraine, has been strengthened by the war. The 2024 security agreements emphasize not only military aid, but also investments in Ukraine's defense industry, signaling a long-term commitment to sovereignty. Tetiana Ogorkova notes that the war has crystallized a distinct Ukrainian identity, separate from Soviet legacies, though challenges of corruption and reconstruction persist. Pathways to a Contained Conflict Ambassador. Sullivan's framework of 21st century containment offers a pragmatic blueprint for managing the conflict. This strategy entails sustained military support for Ukraine, sanctions enforcement, and diplomatic isolation of Russia, acknowledging that territorial resolution may take decades. However, the No Agenda podcast warns against conflating Ukraine's defense with unchecked CIA militarism, which risks perpetuating cycles of escalation. 14. The war's ultimate trajectory hinges on three variables: Ukraine's capacity to leverage advanced weaponry, Russia's economic endurance under sanctions, and the West's political will to maintain unity. As of February 2025, neither side possesses a decisive advantage, suggesting a protracted conflict that will continue to reshape global energy markets, alliance structures, and norms of state sovereignty.